Slide. Okay. So we are active in the social media. So basically, all the webinars, all the talk that are conducted on this project are being recorded and being uploaded into the YouTube. And we are also in the Instagram and also in the Facebook. Right. Okay, I'll skip this. So basically the vision of this project is actually to provide awareness to the global community on mangrove conservation, especially through the use of technology. And under this project, we have a specific site in Selangor, okay, which is the recreational center of Kampung Sejankang. And this is basically a site where the community there is very active in edu-recreational activities. So everyone is invited. Dr. Carolyn, you're also invited to come to Malaysia, okay, to look at this site. And this site is actually being converted from, by the community from a landfill to this beautiful recreational park. Okay, so under this project, actually, we have different groups who are specifically working on different themes. Okay, from looking at the aquatic biodiversity there, okay, at the site itself. And what is special about this project is we also have groups from the Faculty of Engineering who are basically experts in the field of Internet of Things and also robotics. So we have already there IoT devices, okay, being installed to monitor important parameters that are related to the mangrove ecosystem. So under the MEITA website, you can see the dashboard. Currently, the responsible network people are still installing, but in next month, you can see the dashboard ready in the MEITA website. So this is where you can see real time, especially the environmental parameters in Kampung Sejankang itself. We also have teams, the robotic teams, looking at the application of robots in terms of monitoring and also education to the youth. Okay, and up to now we have had quite a number of talks and also webinars. Okay, from when the project started, which is from March 2019, and we're actually coming to the end. Okay, so other than that, we are also now trying to develop online courses, especially for the layman. So this is among the first few, webinars and also talk, okay, during the beginning of the project. Okay, we even have up to involvement of 100 secondary school students who are working together with the university student. And we have had, a mangrove education program. This is actually dedicated for the youth there in collaboration with Malaysian Natural Society and also the Ministry of Education Malaysia, where more than 500 participants joined. Okay. And we're actually in the midst of this international MEITA IoT challenge, where it is open to university students to come out with prototype or ideas on ways to conserve mangrove ecosystem through the use of technology. And under this program, we had this talk, okay, where it is actually a knowledge sharing session. We also have workshop from the robotics team led by Prof. Atif. Even we have a pitching training session for the participants. We have had talk from Dr. Jayani before and Prof. Farida Hanum, where Dr. Satyam is also the moderator. Thank you for agreeing to be the moderator again. And we had this IoT coaching session with the expert from Faculty of Engineering led by Prof. Adwati. And today we are honored to have Dr. Carolyn from National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research, New Zealand. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Carolyn. So I pass the floor to Dr. Satyam.
Great, great. Thank you. Excellent introduction. And I saw very good progress of the project. It is really mesmerizing. You know, it's a team spirit and excellent work. And you have chosen the right partners. And
Yes, I had a great
yeah,
team.
that's really great. And we are so lucky to have the people like Carolyn also today to join
Indeed,
us and
indeed.
to be part of this MEITA project. Thank you so much, Natra, for the
Yeah.
excellent introduction. And
Dr.
I
Dixon
may,
is also here. Hi,
yeah,
Dr.
great.
Dixon.
Hello. Hello.
Dixon, yeah, good morning.
Hello. Good morning to everyone.
Good morning. Good morning. So let me say a few words about Dr. Carolyn. It's nice to introduce. She is so experienced and a well-renowned person. She to the socio-ecological research and also for the policy making issues. So if I begin with a small short biography of Dr. Carolyn. Dr. Carolyn did her BSc in marine biology from the University of California, Los Angeles, and also obtained her PhD in ecology from the same university. She moved to New Zealand in 2000 and now working as associate professor in the School of Environment at the University of Auckland. And she's also a principal scientist at the National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research. Dr. Carolyn is an applied marine biologist. She's looking into both scientific and also socio-ecological aspects in decision making for coastal and ocean management. This is very crucial field of research, especially in the light of climate change nowadays. And her research interests are diverse. Of course, I can see that if I speak, read out everything, I think one day is not enough. But anyway, I try to make it short, ranging from management of mangroves and also other coastal wetlands. So this is very important to reviewing the impacts of climate change. So she's very. It is the need of our talk is so much important for all of us because climate change is the one going to impact each and every place. You know, there is no excuse for any place. So we all have to be, vigilant on this kind of current issues. So very nice current topic Dr. Carolyn is going to talk about today. So definitely it is on. It is going to raise awareness on this particular socio-ecological aspects and how to deal with climate change, on the coastal mangrove ecosystem. Dr. Carolyn is also a member of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Task Force since 2014. And she's currently extending her services as a co-chair for this IPBES. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Carolyn to deliver her speech on socio-ecological challenges associated with expanding mangrove forest in New Zealand. It is, Dr. Carolyn, to be frank, actually, though we are working in mangroves for a long time, very little we come across New Zealand. You know, a lot of information we miss always that part. You know, maybe it is definitely at one part of the world, or I don't know. We always look into Southeast Asia and in US, blah blah blah. We compare so many things, but coming to New Zealand, we somehow it was paid less attention. I don't know, but definitely you are going to bring up this glory to the mangrove research, and especially as that Professor Natra said, it is time for you to pay a visit to Malaysia also, because a lot of mangrove management issues are very much linked with socio-ecology. For example, when you must have heard about mangrove forest, which is under the silvicultural management since more than 100 years now. It is local communities, they exploit mangroves for charcoal production and coal productions. So it is really well connected, and it is the place for you to come and visit and to be part of our research teams also. So thank you, Carolyn, for to be with us for today. And I give this session to you to share your knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Satyan, and thank you, Natra, also for inviting me to be part of this, the MEITA project. I'm currently in Wellington today. So I've managed to, the room that they saved for me here at our Ministry of Education building where I had a meeting, I've got Parliament right behind me. So I wanted to give everyone that view as well, where, but let me see if I can get it to share. Oh, I think I need someone to give me permission to share my PowerPoint.
Please do.
Okay, wait.
Or I can quickly send it to you.
Yeah, all right. You should be able to share now.
Yes. Now I just need to find it. Okay. All right, hopefully everyone can see this now.
Yes, Carolyn.
And I am on Wi-Fi, so hopefully the internet connection is stable as I'm a guest in this building. But I think what I wanted to talk to you today is about mangroves in New Zealand, which is in a lot of ways very similar to a lot of the tropical mangrove forests. In a lot of ways, it's also very different, but I know we've had a similar presentation. One of my former graduate students, Suyadi, is in Indonesia, and within one of their training courses on tropical mangrove ecology, I gave a presentation on New Zealand, and we were quite surprised with, even though temperate and tropical mangroves are seen as being very, very different, it was quite surprising to see what similarities in the types of challenges we had with the societal expectations and uses and challenges on preserving mangrove forests in a lot of places when there are other uses that are often taking precedence over them. I also want to make sure I thank you, my team. This is just a whole pile of my former students and technicians and postdocs, and I think I've even got both of my children in there. We have a pretty large team at NIWA, which is one of our government agencies, and then I work at the same time at our University of Auckland. So we have a great pile of researchers who've been working on mangroves, and so I'll mostly be referring to a lot of the work of my graduate students, actually, who have put substantial amount of time into creating the knowledge base around mangroves in New Zealand. So what is different about mangroves in New Zealand? Well, we're the southernmost mangroves in the world. And if you look at where mangroves are supposed to live, it's not us. So our mangroves go down to about 30, I think it's about 38 degrees latitude. So mangroves are not supposed to really live about south of 20 degrees latitude. And then the temperature where mangroves are supposed to live, we're told that you can't get colder than 20 degrees. And our mangroves in New Zealand live right up to the frost limits, just down in the southern Bay of Plenty. I might have another picture that gives all of New Zealand in just a second, but that what's in the picture right there is basically our northern kind of tip of New Zealand that's doesn't have a scale, but it's actually from the bottom to the top of the picture is probably about 6 to 8 hours of driving. So that actually is quite a long stretch. And I'm not sure if, I think you might be able to see my pointer. This is the Firth of Thames, and I believe this is one of the largest intact mangrove stands in the Southern Hemisphere. It's about maybe 2 kilometers wide, 2 to 4 kilometers wide, depending on where it is within the stand. And it stretches out for approximately 30 or 40 kilometers. And that stand did not exist in the 1950s or even earlier when James Cook came to New Zealand. He noted that were mangroves up a tidal creek, but there weren't actually a giant mangrove stand. And so a lot of mangrove ecology in New Zealand is we're a place where mangroves are quite happy to be increasing, and they're increasing at quite rapid rates. And I'll show you some of the numbers from one of my students' work, but on average about 4% per year more mangroves. And this makes mangroves quite a different challenge to what is experienced in a lot of other places in the world where we have mangrove habitats, where mangroves are seen in other places for their ecological role, and they're often taken out to either be used, as you were saying, either in charcoal or in displacement to put in either tourism or shrimp or aquaculture plants. So there are a lot of reasons that people use habitats where mangroves are. Well, in New Zealand, we're the opposite, where mangroves are coming in and displacing other habitats. But then a lot of the things about mangroves are the same. They live in that intertidal zone, so they do need the salt water to be competitive, and it's just that really upper half of the intertidal zone that they live in. We just have one species also, so we're very unusual in that we only have one type of mangrove. On the other hand, our mangroves are quite morphologically different, often even within the same harbor and the same stand, where we have often very tall mangroves. So in the upper North Island, where it's almost subtropical, our mangroves might hit 6 or 8 meters in height. And in the far south, they're often just less than 1 meters or between 1 and 2 meters tall. And at the same time, we also have stands all the way through the north, through to the southern limits, where we have what we call hobbit mangroves. So if you know the Lord of the Rings movies, the hobbits are the tiny little race of people in the Lord of the Rings, and we have hobbit mangroves. So we have lots of locations where our mangroves are actually knee height. So they're really less than 1 meter tall, quite short, and quite different in their ecological roles. So with this massive expansion of mangroves in New Zealand over the last 5 or 6 decades, we have a lot of resource management issues revolving around mangroves. And there's that picture that shows the upper North Island and roughly that 38° south latitude, which is kind of our southern limit. But in New Zealand, where we have mangroves, where once people had beachfront property, they now have mangroves directly adjacent to their holiday property, or they can no longer access the shore, or they see mangroves as having replaced important habitats for fisheries, for shellfish, and for seagrass meadows and other habitats that might have been there 50 or more years ago, but have been degraded due to various other reasons, not usually because the mangroves came in, but we have a lot of sediment coming in land in New Zealand from what we do on land, from development of land, changing from pristine native forest into agricultural landscapes and urban landscapes. And New Zealand is a very steep and hilly country with lots of sediment erosion. So what we've done on land has caused this huge amount of sediment to come into our coasts and estuaries, and this has created more habitat for mangroves. So mangroves have even hit Parliament. Again, that's right behind me. And we had a parliamentary select committee debating a bill to allow mangrove removal. It actually was declined, so we don't have that, but there were certainly a lot of people who, members of regular society, that saw mangroves as a pest and wanted mangroves removed. And they're actually protected as a native species, so you would require a consent and a reason to remove them. So what do we actually know about mangroves in New Zealand? Well, in the 1980s, there weren't as many mangroves around 40 years ago, and everybody wanted to protect our mangroves. So there was a lot of literature about protecting mangroves and the hugely important roles that they had, but there wasn't much research done in New Zealand. So most of the research, we took these stories that we had from tropical mangrove research, how mangroves had huge roles for fish, for invertebrates, were hugely productive, and all these types of things that we know are associated, I think, I'm pretty sure, with mangroves in Malaysia and Indonesia and throughout the tropics. And we assume those rules work for mangroves in New Zealand. But it took quite a number of years for the research on mangroves in New Zealand to actually catch up to see whether or not these things were true. And so really over the last 20 years, and a lot of this has been done by a whole series of graduate students at the University of Auckland, in Auckland, New Zealand, and the University of Waikato in Hamilton, New Zealand. And these students have really tried to tackle a lot of these areas where we just didn't have the information yet. And does this work? Do mangroves sequester carbon? Are New Zealand Avicennia marina? Do they serve a coastal protection role? What is their primary productivity? Do they serve as nursery habitats for fish and invertebrates? And we've more or less found that some of these roles are actually quite strong. So we know New Zealand mangroves, and I'll show you some of this in just a few slides, that they're on par with the smaller tropical mangrove species for carbon sequestration. We know that they're on par with the smaller of the tropical species for primary productivity. On the other hand, the coastal protection buffer differs quite hugely between whether it's a tall or a short mangrove. So we have a huge variability in whether or not coastal protection is actually being provided, no different from the rest of the world, based on how big that mangrove stand is and where it's located relative to waves and wind conditions. On the other hand, some things like the nursery habitat for fish, and even really for bird habitat, we don't have any fish or birds that are obligately or only associated with mangroves in New Zealand. In fact, a lot of the birds that are associated with mangroves are actually equally or more associated with adjacent salt marsh habitats, but salt marsh habitats have declined to about 1% of their original extent in New Zealand over the last 100 or 200 years. So we don't have extensive or pristine salt marsh habitats anymore. So a lot of these birds are now moving and utilizing mangroves that they wouldn't have done previously. So I thought I'd just review some of the work that we've done on blue carbon, just to give you an idea of where what we know in New carbon. And we've done a lot of work through primarily one of my PhD students, Richard Bulmer, who did his PhD at the University of Auckland and now works with me at NIWA. But also we've had an ongoing collaboration with the Blue Carbon Lab at Deakin University in Australia, where we've been doing, you can see here in these bottom photos, collecting a lot of deep sediment cores to look at carbon storage in the sediment over time. And I think within Richard's PhD, we really compiled a lot of the initial evidence that we needed about how mangroves work, how big are our mangrove trees, what is the relationship between height and both above and also below ground biomass. So what do we have underground? That picture on the bottom right then shows you that amount of biomass that we have underground. And a lot of our local communities don't actually understand that usually at least somewhere between 1 and about 5 times more total biomass of the mangroves in New Zealand is actually under the sediment surface. So when they're seeing mangroves, they're not actually seeing the whole thing. Rich also did a lot of work on carbon and nutrient fluxes. So looking at how that whole carbon and nutrient cycling worked in our New Zealand mangrove ecosystems. But also one of the things he did was looking at the fluxes from our, if you want to call them mangrove peatlands. So after mangroves had been removed, are we seeing a lot of carbon fluxes? So we're seeing carbon released into the atmosphere, and that's not something we want it to happen. We want the carbon within the mangroves. So this has filled a lot of the gaps and really let us know that mangroves really are kind of within what we'd expect for carbon sequestration. But then we've also done a lot of work where we've compared the blue carbon across estuary habitats. So here we have just a study that we did in Tairua Harbor, which is on the Coromandel Peninsula. So kind of on the northeast of or just to the northeast of Auckland. And in this particular estuary, we looked at carbon in these deep cores, so about a meter deep sediment core, and looked to see how much carbon storage there was across the different habitats, because one of our interests was knowing how much more carbon is there in salt marsh and mangrove than there is in other habitats. And I think what we found was quite surprising is often we don't do comparisons of how much carbon we have stored in our sand flats and mud flats, as well as our seagrass habitats. And what we found in this study is, yes, we did have more carbon in mangroves and in salt marsh. Salt marsh are the red bars and mangroves are the orange bars. But we actually had reasonably good amounts of carbon within our our sand flat and mud flat habitats as well. And then these also had some seagrass transects, and the seagrass itself wasn't that much more efficient at storing carbon than non-vegetated habitats. The seagrass we have is primarily intertidal and has blade lengths of about 8 to 10 centimeters. So it's not a very big or extensive seagrass. So it was quite interesting to see this relative carbon. And if you took these estimates and sum them up cumulatively across the proportion of each habitat, it's actually our sand flats that are the major contributor in most of our New Zealand estuaries to blue carbon, because they're so extensive and do at least have some measurement, notable measurements of blue carbon, though certainly not as high on an aerial rate as those of mangrove and of salt marsh. We've also done quite a bit of work on the trophic role of mangroves. So this is the work of another one of my former graduate students, Rebecca Gladstone Gallagher, and she looked at what the trophic role was. So what are mangroves producing? And then how is this production incorporated into the food web in New Zealand estuaries? And does that productivity or that leaf litter fall actually change community dynamics in New Zealand? And I think, we found some things that weren't surprising compared to litter fall across similar mangrove species. The amount of litter fall was on par. We've also looked at this across latitudes, so going from the northern part of the North Island all the way down to that southern limit of about 38 degrees latitude. And we don't actually see any latitudinal differences in productivity either in New Zealand. So, and that's from about 34 to 38 degrees latitude, that we don't see any latitudinal change, which was something we were told to expect to find. On the other hand, we do see quite huge seasonal differences. Not surprising, our leaf litter primarily falls in the summertime, but the biggest difference compared to tropical mangroves is, yes, we do have our leaf litter incorporated into food webs, but it is very slow. And I thought I had a figure, but it might be in the next slide. Nope, it's not in there. I think I've lost one of my figures, but looking at decomposition rates, our decomposition rates, usually leaves will be incorporated more or less, at least 50% or more decomposes in tropical sites within about a week. And in New Zealand mangroves, it's actually substantially slower and often up to about 3 months for that 50% decay rate. So our leaf litter, it does go into the New Zealand food webs, but it's much slower and has a much kind of more limited role in driving our food webs in New Zealand estuaries. We do know a little about eco-defense. So where most landowners are often interested in removing mangroves rather than planting them, here's just one example of a landowner, and this is a kiwi fruit plantation in the Bay of Plenty, where this landowner was looking at challenges with erosion, and he planted a whole bunch of mangroves. So you can see those 3 rows of mangroves that he's planted in front of his property, but still leaving access for his boat to access the shore right through the middle. And I'm not sure this is going to show up very well on your screens, but this is basically a picture of the wave dynamics. And you can see on the picture on the right that the waves and the associated erosion is then substantially dampened by the mangroves as you got close to shore, so that he's not having the same problems with erosion of his land that his neighbors are. So yes, we know they can do this role of eco-defense in New Zealand, and it's starting to be noticed a little bit more as we're having more and more problems with coastal erosion, particularly with sea level rise and changes in storm frequency due to climate change. But meanwhile, what is the problem with mangroves in New Zealand? Well, we're starting to get more of this knowledge, but most of this knowledge had come around after the mangroves had substantially spread. So I've got another picture of a very typical example of how many mangroves we had with white 1944. So most of our first aerial images in New Zealand were during World War II. Then typically the next set of aerial images was not until 1978. And then we started getting frequent aerial images from the late 90s and early 2000s in most areas. But you can see from this image that mangroves in the 40s, which is what we're told from historical writings, those white blobs that you can see would have been what mangroves were pre-European history. So in upper tidal creeks, we did have mangroves, but they typically weren't in a lot of the abundance that they are currently in estuaries. And then we'd seen reasonably gradual spread, again, that 4% or 3.4% per year for our Auckland estuaries on average. And what one of my students, Suyati, has done in his PhD was actually use the aerial images that we had throughout the Auckland estuaries and show not just the changes in all mangrove extent, but also see how the morphologies of mangroves were changing over time, and showing that, yes, we are increasing in tall mangroves. That was about 1% per year. But that bottom line graph in the plot here, our increase in these dwarf or hobbit mangroves is about 20% a year on average since the 70s. So we're showing a huge change in the abundance of these smaller mangroves that have less ecological value than our tall and extensive mangrove forests that would have dominated the mangrove forest prior to European colonization in New Zealand. So why are mangroves expanding in New Zealand? Well, the big challenge is land use. So again, we have lots of sediment runoff due to changes in how we manage land. Some of the changes are just due to changing hydrodynamics. That picture in the middle shows where we have basically blocked off the entranceway to an estuary through the building of a motorway. And that's resulted in basically a lot of sediment clogging up that estuary, but also a lot of the seeds not having anywhere to be transported. So we have rate of infilling by mangroves. We haven't yet really seen any huge changes due to sea level rise, but we're looking into this to see, now that we're getting better satellite imagery from the Sentinel sites, to see if we can actually detect some of this inshore shift. And one of the technicians that works with Rich Bulmer and I is starting to get some good information on that, suggesting we are seeing some movement inshore with climate change. But through Suyati's PhD, again, we did a whole bunch of, or he did a whole bunch of remote sensing of satellite images to look at where mangroves were expanding and changes, where things changed from these tall mangroves to short mangroves, where mangroves expanded. And he came up with 5 main types of mangrove expansion that you can see there. And the most common one in New Zealand is actually the second one, that seaward expansion. So we are quite different, again, to the rest of the world, where our mangroves are actually expanding to where the sediment has been deposited. So they're expanding out toward the ocean rather than inshore. And that's the primary type of transition that we see. But we also see a lot of this fifth one, or this transition, where we see these dwarf or hobbit mangroves replacing our tall mangroves. And then just here, he did also a whole bunch of comparisons and multivariate regressions with climate variables, and it showed that 53% of the variation in mangrove expansion, so mangrove expansion, was mostly explained by the catchment change. So basically that reduction in forest that was binding the sediment, which is associated with sediment erosion in our changing sediment qualities in the estuaries. So we know why mangroves are expanding, but typically your average landowner or a person with a coastal house doesn't recognize what the cause of the mangrove removal was. They only were seeing that suddenly we had mangroves. And so from the early 2000s, we had a lot of political action groups and estuary care groups that were basically founded around how do we get rid of these mangroves on our shore? We don't want these anymore. And they had a whole bunch of consents to do very small removals. Many of these small removals were quite successful. If you look in the picture on the right or in the middle that says Tauranga, in that picture, you can still see the stumps there of the mangroves. This is about 5 years after mangroves were removed, but the sediment is generally healthy. And we would say that, yes, this habitat had recovered to a healthy state after mangroves were removed. On the other hand, we had other consents like this picture on the right. About 10 years after the mangroves were removed, it had already been recolonized. So there was this, if we remove mangroves, you know, getting around that question of whether or not we should remove mangroves, but often there was no further research to see did the mangroves immediately come back again or not. And then because a couple community groups were very successful with removing mangroves, then other community groups joined that lovely group to say, well, we want to remove mangroves too. And in about 2010, the first major resource consent went through, and this was to remove about 100 hectares of mangroves in Tauranga Harbor in 11 different sub-estuaries. So I'm not sure if you can see it on, there's 12 sub-estuaries that they originally did, but only 11 of them actually went through. And in these 11 sub-estuaries, all around this one harbor, they did this using a mechanical mulching tractor, and they left all the mulch on the sediment. And when this consent went through, this is when a lot of the science organizations got involved, because they went, what on earth are you doing and who approved that? That is really stupid, and you're going to create a lot of impacts that you didn't expect. The scientists were right. On the other hand, it made us realize that by the mangrove debate, we'd actually led a lot of the conditions for community groups to want to remove mangroves to actually be enhanced. So that basically spawned a whole bunch of research on, can mangrove mulching work? Did it cause a great mess? Yes, it did. But then there was also a lot of cherry picking of science by a lot of groups that wanted to still remove mangroves because they'd seen it happen somewhere else. They didn't like mangroves either. And so we had a whole bunch of kind of rampant destruction in New Zealand going on of a lot of our mangrove forests. And it was, really quite shocking and horrible that this was all going on. But then we really had everybody stepping up because they were seeing these major ecological impacts, whether it was algal blooms or vehicle tracking or anoxic sediments or hydrogen sulfide odors. And these pictures are all between kind of 2 and 5 years after the mangrove mulching. So again, these are quite large areas of estuaries, again, about over 100 hectares in just one harbor that had kind of very similar impacts. I think in this picture right here, I've got 5 of the 12 different estuaries within this larger harbor, and all of them had similar impacts. So this really was then starting to make other councils take note. We have 4 regional councils or governing bodies that have mangroves in their jurisdiction. And so one of them funded us to do a review of all the mangrove removals that had happened in their jurisdiction to see, well, did it work? Did the mud disperse? Does the site look healthy now? And the short of it, we went to 40 different places from our Bay of Plenty toward the south. That's right about 38 latitude up to Whangarei, which is in the northernmost district. And across these 40 sites, there were 3 out of 40 that had actually recovered and looked healthy. And I think the age range was to about 15 or 16 years after mangrove removal had occurred. But typically what we saw was these few exposed sites. There were 3 of them looked okay, and they were trending towards sandier sediments. But most of the sheltered sites where the hydrodynamics had been changed through the buildup of motorways or other changes had occurred, most of these muddy sheltered sites looked exactly the same as they did before. They had high amounts of vegetation, so that underground biomass was still there, the root material was still there, the stumps were still evident, and they still had very muddy sediments. So basically, they looked unhealthy, they were unhealthy, and all the metrics that we checked showed that removing mangroves there wasn't a good idea. Yet mangrove removal still persisted because society was interested in looking at, well, is there a way we could do it that doesn't cause a whole bunch of harm? And so here we worked with one of the councils in Whangamata to show that, yes, you could have a method where we had very little impact. So this picture on the bottom right shows 5 years after mangrove removal occurred, and it looks like a healthy sand flat. All of us would look at that, but if you look up close, we still can see where the mangroves were. But we did work with one council to see that, yes, we could remove mangroves and create a healthy habitat. On the other hand, what's interesting with this council is they're not really doing any mangrove removal anymore because they found it was quite expensive. So it's been interesting to see how things change. We're also looking at how once mangroves had been removed, can you then further make sure that the expansion doesn't occur by looking at where seedlings are transported and how seedling survival changes based on location. So those 3 lines in this plot are 3 different places where we removed or where we looked at seedling survival and growth rates. And the blue line is a very wave-swept environment, and we found at this one site, most of the mangroves within about 3 months, about 1% of them had been dislodged, so very low rates of mangrove survival. But most of the other more typical tidal creeks where we see high rates of mangrove expansion saw between 40 and 60% seedling survival. And I think the next picture coming up was just some work we did with one of the community groups that was initially quite interested in mangrove removal. And they helped us show how quickly mangroves were expanding in their bays. This is in southern Auckland, so a very urban catchment. And just the pictures here are between February and September, a year and a half later, and you can see they're actually the same exact spot that I'm standing. I just took the picture in different directions, but you can see that we have trees, and they were actually reproductively successful that next season, over 1 meter tall. And so it's quite surprising to us how quickly the mangroves can grow, because that's not what we see in the literature on this species. So where are we now? Well, we're basically bringing all these pieces of the puzzle together. And within a lot of what our regional and central government is doing is how do we include not just the societal and political pressures on removing mangroves, but also starting to consider a lot more what are those ecosystem services that our mangroves provide, whether it's our carbon sequestration, the trophic role, the coastal protection, the habitat for other species, and really filling a lot of the gaps that we had 20 years ago, where we really didn't know the role that mangroves had in New Zealand, and they were very much perceived as a pest species. But also understanding what those impacts of removing mangroves are. So helping to, even though it seems quite unpleasant to work on what happens after you remove mangroves, by then presenting what the actual impacts are and the likelihood of change, then we actually had the ability to influence policy and management so that people knew that just because you removed mangroves, they weren't necessarily going to get a healthy estuarine habitat after the mangroves removed. So lots of providing information and a lot of working with community groups and other stakeholders, but most importantly, really connecting why are mangroves expanding. And our big challenge is this sediment erosion from land. So what is the big reason mangroves are expanding in New Zealand? It's because we do poor catchment management in a lot of our catchments. Now, where are we now? We're turning a lot more toward looking at, well, what is going to happen with sea level rise and climate change? And we just got a new grant to look at how much we're going to see changes in mangrove distributions, as well as how that will change the carbon sequestration as we're looking to the Paris Agreement and New Zealand's contributions to that. You know, are we anticipating changes in the role of blue carbon over time, over the upcoming decades? But in short, in New Zealand, our big challenge is managing our catchments so that we don't have these impacts in estuaries, and just moving from that to this much more holistic framework of managing mangroves as one of many parts of the ecosystem that is a healthy and native member of our estuarine ecosystems. Obviously, this has been, I think, about 15 years work that I've tried to just put into one little presentation, but we've had lots and lots of funding with our 2 primary grants here from our Ministry of Science, as well as a lot of co-funding from each of our regional councils, and lots of work with these amazing estuary care groups who both worked with us when their original goal was to remove mangroves, but they've both taught us more about mangroves and what they're experiencing and what they're seeing to help us see their point of view, as well as us helping teach them about mangroves and the reasons for mangrove expansion. So thank you very much. And hopefully we have time for questions. I think I went a lot longer than I expected, so apologies for that.
Oh no, Carolyn, it was excellent, excellent. So much for this fabulous talk. And yes, it has always been, I mean, now you can stop. Yeah, that's good, that's great. Actually, it has always been challenging, as you know, policy and science, coming together is always, the scientists have a big trouble. And more or less, people's perceptions, that's always really matters for the conservation. Sometimes we have strong policies, but that doesn't work really in the field because the people have, the local people have different mindset. That's what we are. So that's why I most of the times think science and society should come together to really bring a change in the conservation. So you have really presented very well how the pros and cons in the situation of expansion and to destroy the mangroves. So this is excellent talk, and this is first time I was listening to the talk of New Zealand. And for other participants also, I believe most of them it is and experience to listen to such a. So yeah, I would love to have some questions from the audience, and there is one participant has already requested posed a question for that, and I don't know why I see this question in a long format. I don't know this.
There are 4 of them.
Yeah, so it is like narrow channel. Yeah, Fatin from UPM. I have a question for Doctor. First one is there any agricultural activities in New Zealand? So maybe at the expense of mangroves, probably. So that was the first question. And second one is there any law to stop the what is it? To stop, really read it properly because in a different format here. Can you see the question clearly?
Yeah, I can see them. So maybe
please,
I can say each one and answer it. So I think the first question, is there any agricultural activities? So when Suyati did his study of mangroves, we looked at our maps of land use change, and the places that were more likely to have mangrove expansion were those that were where our native forest had been changed into agricultural or pastoral landscapes. So, most definitely a huge association. And then a lot of the estuaries that have much smaller amounts of mangroves today are those that have intact native forest in the catchments. So we did see a very strong association of places with more pristine areas were much less likely to have mangrove expansion. Let's see, the second question, is there any law to protect mangroves? So mangroves for us are a native tree, and that means they're covered under legislation that protects native plants and trees. What's interesting from another legal point of view is pine trees and other things do count for our climate targets. So they are accounted for in climate budgets, but mangroves are not. Because we have a 6-meter height minimum for the trees to count in the climate budget. So that's all currently being restructured a little bit with the new Paris Agreement and our new climate targets. So we may see mangroves in the next iteration being included in our climate budgets, but at the current moment, we don't have blue carbon in our carbon assessments every year. Let's see, the next one, how do you overcome algal bloom problems? So the algal blooms we see primarily in places where we have high nutrients or where the mangrove mulching occurred. We saw a lot of smothering of the sediment, and that those anoxic conditions caused a lot of nutrient release. I'm not a chemist, so bear with me that my chemistry isn't that good to know the exact processing, but a lot of places where mangroves have been removed, where they were removed poorly, we have the algal blooms. And then in this one place where we did adaptive management, by minimizing the amount of disturbance when the mangroves removed, we didn't see the algal blooms happen at all. So it was something we could easily control. On the other hand, we do have huge differences in the estuaries in New Zealand on where we have algal blooms, and most of it is quite linked to sewage or nutrient pollution. So in Tauranga Harbour, they have regular blooms, and a lot of that is historical because of sewage outfalls within the harbor, whereas in the last couple of decades in Southland, so we don't have any mangroves down there, but Southland has huge algal problems, and it's directly associated with nutrients coming from dairy. So because of the huge demand for New Zealand dairy products in the last 10 or 20 years, we have tenfold more cows than we did before. And the big place where a lot of the cows are that they weren't before are down in the South Island, where previously it wasn't economical because the price wasn't high enough to support cows there with the amount of kind of nutrient addition, what they had to do to make enough forage crops grow in these areas that are on the East Coast. They're a bit drier. And so we have big problems with algal blooms in our Southland and our Canterbury regions. So kind of that whole South Island, East Coast. On the other hand, outside of Tauranga on the North Island, where we have mangroves, we don't have problems with algal blooms typically. So it's actually quite interesting where we have mangroves, we seem to be seeing what we think is a nutrient trapping role from the mangroves that's helping to prevent algal blooms. I was going to say there's a fourth question, it's disappeared. Is there any selective species of mangroves for replanting? So we've only got the one, but I know I've been asked that before is, well, why don't you bring in other mangrove species? And can you bring in any big, huge, tall mangroves? And I know on the other side, we've been asked by a colleague in Germany who wanted to move mangroves to Germany. So can we take our very tolerant of these different temperature conditions, our New Zealand mangroves, and move them and plant them in Germany? We know our New Zealand mangroves, they do survive if they're planted further south. So down to about 42 degrees latitude, I think that's what we are here. Where there have been, I think, at least 3 different successful plantings on the south end of the North Island or the north end of the South Island, where mangroves have lived through to adulthood, been alive for 20 or 30 years, and we have a stand of 10 or 20 mangroves in these 3 different locations. So they certainly can live once they've gotten through the original very frost intolerant juvenile stage. But usually it's seen as that the juveniles are not tolerant to frost, and that's the main reason for their southern distribution. We also don't have a lot of estuaries from that kind of 38-degree latitude line. We start turning into braided rivers, so we don't have the huge estuaries with the same type of sediment. So there actually isn't a lot of suitable habitat regardless until we get to that kind of middle band right between the top of the north or the bottom of the North and the top of the South Island, where we do see a lot of mangroves. But I would suspect in New Zealand, we wouldn't ever get permission to move a different species of mangroves in here just because of our biosecurity rules.
That's understandable.
Now, did you want me to continue on? I see a few more have come in.
Please, please.
And does anyone want to ask theirs in person, or is it easiest for me just to read them and answer? Maybe I'll just read them. Okay, so we have one from Giovanna. So what is the reason for the transition from tall mangroves to dwarf mangroves? Very interesting question. I don't know. What we think is going on is more within the soil properties and the salinity. So our tall mangroves tend to be living right on the edges of the channel where they have the most exposure to flow and fresh water coming in twice a day from the oceans. We have a twice daily low tide. And then as you move further up towards shore, that tends to be where we have these dwarf mangroves or these shorter ones. And so from what we can tell, it tends to be embayments that don't have as much water flow or as much exposure to fresh water, and maybe are far more likely to be dominated by freshwater inputs from land. As well as the challenges with kind of that nutrient chemistry in the soil, we're guessing is that much more limited. So that's why we think, or what we think is going on, but it isn't something anyone has studied yet that I'm aware of. So we were hoping to get a new student in, and because of COVID, we haven't been able to get that student in the country. But definitely something we're interested in learning more about. And I think the next question is, so salt marshes are left to just 1% of their original cover. And is that because of expansion of mangroves? And actually, the salt marshes, we have quite good vertical zonation. So we'll have our salt marshes typically live further inshore of where our mangroves do. So in general, it's more the land use and infilling. So we've had a lot of infilling of salt marsh, particularly around our big cities like Christchurch and Auckland, and Wellington even. So most of the salt marsh was easy to basically put dredge materials on and then build land. I think where I am right now, I'm probably on original salt marsh or very close to what used to be salt marsh here in Wellington. And I know we have, you can walk down to the shore and you can see where the original coastline was 100 years ago in Wellington, but most of that has been infilled. So most of the problem was actually infilling and human conversion of land. On the other hand, we do have from a few aerial photographs, we can see where mangrove expansion has resulted in changes. But very few locations where we know there was once salt marsh there and there's now mangroves. On the other hand, we also know there are problems with stock. So our dairy cows and sheep going into land as well. So of our coastal areas outside of big cities, we have agricultural land right up to the edge of the coast. And then the cows they'll eat pickleweed. I think it's Salicornia, but the species name might have changed since I learned all my species. But they will eat that one. And then they'll also eat mangrove seeds. And then you often see the livestock kind of using that area as a salt lick. So we do have, a lot of problems of salt or access of stock into the salt marshes that has also caused degradation of the salt marsh habitat. But I think we've got a couple sites that we're hoping to look at, and this is really just about a week ago, maybe not even a week ago, it might have been Friday last week that we got some new results where we were looking at aerial imagery just over the last 10 years since we've had, I think it's Sentinel and Sentinel-2. Everyone on the phone call will probably know more about satellites than I do. This is work that Rich Bulmer has been leading with one of our technicians. And when we are looking at this really small scale, whenever we don't have cloud cover and we can get good imagery, and then they've done a bunch of spectral imaging, so using that hyperspectral color spectrum stuff. Sorry, again, everyone else knows more than I do here probably, but looking at that very small scale change that we can do now, whereas previously we only had aerial photo images every 1 or 2 decades, but now we're able to look at that really small scale change both over really monthly. We have monthly or bi-monthly images for most years going back about 10 years. And we were looking at it for changes in mangrove expansion, but what we've actually found is when we get at that really small scale in the last 2 decades, we're also seeing a gradual inshore migration. What we don't have is we don't have good spectral imaging models yet for salt marshes, because we see a lot of differences in color. So like the pickleweed I mentioned, we can see it as yellow or pinkish red or purple. And then we do have probably hundreds of species that live in our salt marshes. So they're, a bit more challenging to get the imaging techniques to work consistently than we have for the mangroves and for the seagrasses that we're both quite good at, just because they are just the one species here that we've got. We also only have one seagrass species in New Zealand, so it's sadly depauperate in seagrass and mangroves. I think there's one more question.
Yeah, exactly. How do you apply the Internet of Things for the management and the role of Internet of Things?
Yeah, and I think I would love to see more done. I think the only thing we've been really doing at all is really just our the machine learning with the aerial images that we've been working on. But beyond that, there's very little that's been going on in New Zealand that really uses good technology. So yes, I'd really be looking forward to bringing more in. And I think Not Trust seminars, I think that's next week or the week after, or hopefully I didn't miss it already. It's been a bit chaotic in New Zealand with us being in lockdown and slightly opened and not opened, and we never know where we're going to be from one week to the next. And this is today and yesterday, it's my first time traveling since July. So it's quite unusual. But yes, but I think there's most definitely a role, and a lot of it is helping our natural scientists to realize the techniques that they can use. A lot of the time we're, seeing people who have fear of technology and don't think they have the skills and aren't willing to actually learn them. And, we have a big separation between those that use technology and those that do field work and boating and diving, and trying to really merge those two sets of skills and get people willing to learn new technologies that they can use in monitoring our seascapes.
It is, I think, very much needed technologies. So much. And are there any questions you can see? I think there are no more questions. No questions. I have some curiosity to know things about this expansion of the mangroves that you said, rapid expansion. Have you been able to link with this kind of climate related changes with relation to the expansion of the mangroves in your area?
Mm-hmm. And I think when Ciati did his study for his PhD, that went from the 1940s through about 2014, I think was the last year of images that he used. And then we had climate data going back. So we would have had temperature data, but a lot of that was the mangrove expansion is auto-correlated. So it's temporally auto-correlated with, expansion has been going on at the same time. We've been seeing changes in temperature. So yes, we do see climate directly correlated with mangrove expansion, but as far as we can tell, it's not a causal factor. It's just that time period that it's really the sediment that's really the driver. Some of the new models that we're working on I think we have models using the different SSP, RCP combinations, trying to look at how we expect our mangrove and salt marsh habitats to change over time. And actually the biggest driver there is not which climate scenario we use, but what we expect is happening on land. So how much additional land management occurs, and if we do have business as usual land management, that implies mangroves will actually be able to keep up with sea level rise. But if we get very good at land management and stop releasing as much of the sediments down our rivers and streams, we'll actually expect to see a substantial decrease in mangrove habitats because they'll hit that kind of border where we have land. And we're already starting to see that in a few places where what was arable land is no longer suitable for dairy cows, particularly on the North Island. So we have, I think, 3 new places where the landowners have gotten very active in conservation because they want to then donate the land that they had taken over that was once an intertidal area, and they're redonating it back to the conservation estate because nothing grows there anymore because it's got saltwater intrusions. So we have 3, if you want to call them, new experiments that are going on where we did have a barrier to saltwater come in, where they've reopened 3 different areas that were agricultural land to saltwater intrusions. So just checking to see what changes, and these are all 3 of them are salt marsh areas. So we'll see how, do we have rapid recolonization of salt marsh? And so we have those 3, and then we have one other area that was part of a treaty settlement with our indigenous peoples. So they basically regained some of their ancestral lands, and they regained an intertidal area with an island in the middle that once had salt marsh, but now was covered with gorse. I don't know if you know gorse. It's one of the prickly weed species, and it gets 1 meter, 2 meters tall, and crops can't eat it because of the prickly bits. And they went in and removed all of the gorse to see what would happen. So this is one of our Maori tribes. And the salt marsh, I haven't been out there in about 3 years, but it was quite amazing. Even within the first 6 months, they were actually seeing a lot of salt marsh regrowth that they didn't expect to happen once they got rid of the gorse. So we're, seeing a lot of changes that, a lot of them are economically driven, where some land is no longer economically valuable, but turning back into sorry, I'm just checking. I think somebody wanted to come into the room and I don't have it booked, but she doesn't. But yes, so it's interesting to see how landowners suddenly don't see areas as valuable anymore, and then they get turned back into conservation, and then it allows us to explore, well, what might happen with climate change with salt water moving upshore into land that wasn't saltwater dominated. So those will be, hopefully some interesting places to work on over the next couple of years.
Good to have that kind of people, donors, for land and conservation effort. There is one more question that posed by.
Okay, this is a long one.
Yesterday. Yeah.
Okay, so while many countries are grappling with mangrove rehabilitation challenges, here in New Zealand, nature is aggressively taking its course, most definitely. And so mangrove expansion or migration or colonization could be explored as a climate change mitigation opportunity. And I think there's quite a bit more on public science should be effectively communicated, since this bad news is not what everybody wants to hear about. I think there's quite a bit more there, but I think exactly that is what we're looking at, and it is already coming up as possible for, again, New Zealand's contribution to the Paris Agreement is, well, could we plant more mangroves? But then the challenge on planting more mangroves, and so this new grant funding that we just got a couple months ago is looking at what's the natural variability in mangrove stocks, because from a New Zealand government point of view, if we suddenly start including New Zealand mangroves in our climate budget, but then sea level rise wipes out all of our mangroves, then we actually suffer pretty severe economic consequences from maybe only 10 or 20 years of benefits of mangroves in our carbon stocks. So, but yeah, that's one thing that we're looking at, is how do we, both contribute to the layperson's understanding of what mangroves and other blue carbon species do provide, but then at the same time recognize what might happen in the future so that we're not selecting something for its short-term benefits when they're not actually going to be there, and then recognize what does need to happen to maintain our mangrove ecosystems in New Zealand. So, are they something that's actually highly threatened due to sea level rise, and we need to actually put management in there? And, it really has been in the last 10 years a big shift in public perceptions of mangroves, mostly because of this one very large mangrove removal exercise where it didn't work. And everybody assumed, mangroves, just like chopping down a tree, it'll be fine. And it was really such a pretty horrible experience. And, it was 3 or 4 years where the areas where the mangroves were smelled quite badly. You still can't walk on them because it's still quite, non-solid, so you might sink up to your knee or deeper where the mangroves were removed. So it's really quite, a very bad choice that made a lot of the changes. On the other hand, the bad choice helped drive government to invest in science in that area, where mangroves really hadn't been a priority at all before.
Yes, there are no more questions in the chat box. Actually, to continue on the tall and dwarf mangroves, we found some similar condition in China, in Guangzhou, in the Guangdong province. That was with the Echinacea species, Echinacea corniculatum. So inside, very close to the freshwater channels, there is a tall Echinacea, but in the newly accreted soils, we have dwarf Echinacea. Within the reasons what you said, like lot of nutrient short.
That might be a good cross comparison.
Exactly,
because I know we've been.
The paper is out actually in the remote sensing published for 2021. It is open access, and we used the Corona satellite data 1967 to compare with the recent satellite data to identify the original mangrove and non-original mangrove in that particular province, Guangdong province.
Yeah,
we come across this tall and dwarf Echinacea corniculatum.
And I think that's one challenge we have is our 1940s photograph. We can't tell height, but from the 1970s we could.
But we just only separated the old batches and new batches based on the old and new satellite data. And we conducted the ground recent ground truth. In the ground truth, we revealed where exactly the dwarf vegetation and where the dwarf is. It's so nice listening to you all. And any hope to have the new mangroves in that harbor? You said Terengganu harbor or something like that. They destroyed the mangroves with the machine. Propellers. So, do you think there are chances to have any plantation of the mangroves in that harbor?
So I'm assuming you're meaning the Tauranga Harbor,
Harbor,
and it was actually a reasonably small proportion of the mangroves that were removed. And I can't remember the exact numbers, but I would guess it was on the order of 20 or 30% of the mangrove estate. So it was the mangroves that are left are still probably 5 or 10 times more mangroves that were there in 1950 in that harbor. So, in that, it brings the question of in management, is our goal to protect mangroves, or is it to maintain a state of equilibrium, which we don't have because everything is changing? Or is our goal to return to what we had in the 1950s, which a lot of our older community, that's what they know and that's what they remember. But a lot of our younger community see mangroves as something that they've always grown up with. And so they don't quite have that perception of mangroves being pests. And so it's, you know, can we, you know, help different people as we have these younger generations come in, teaching them that, yes, mangroves are native species and they've been in New Zealand for millions of years. It's not, they're not a new immigrant that's just come over from Australia. They've actually been here for millions of years and they are a natural part of our ecosystem.
Excellent, excellent. I think a new is a new insight of, you know, the youngsters when they are aware of the importance of mangroves, and that's going to create a lot of change. So thank you so much, Carolyn. I think we already dealt with all the questions so far. So Natra, I leave it to you. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Carolyn, for the nice talk and also for the great answer for all the questions that we're having. It's very interactive. So before we leave, can we just have a group picture together, all of us?
Ooh, let me make sure we've got the...
Yeah.
No, I'm going the wrong way. There we go.
Your background is excellent.
I've got the Parliament sitting in the background and I've got my laptop is sitting on top of my suitcase. I've got to run to the airport in a few minutes.
Oh my God.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, we troubled you.
Okay, Fariha or Maya, Fatin, okay, can you just snap a picture of us? Okay.
Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay, one more. Give you a big smile. Smile. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank you,
again,
Carolyn,
Dr. Carolyn. Thanks, Dr. Satyam, Dr. Dixon, and everyone for joining the session.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Vanessa.
hope to see all of you.
And hopefully I'll see you soon in Malaysia.
Yes,
Please,
yes,
please do come.
please come, yes.
All right.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Also visit my university, Universiti Malaysia, Terengganu. It's a wonderful university. We have been working together with the Belgian partners, Farid, and we are working together with Natra. It's a very big team for you to come and enjoy, to explore some more sites. Take care. Have a safe
All right. Okay, take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Dr. Carolyn.
Thank you, everyone.
Lega habis dah. Bye-bye.
Bye semua. Thank you.